Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining Van Cortlandt House Museum this evening for Eric K. Washington's illustrated talk, The Legacy of Former Colored School Number 4. My name is Margaret Holmes, and I'm the director of the museum. I met Eric when he attended another talk at the museum in October of last year. The speaker was Isaac Colding, and he was discussing the life of David Ruggles and the New York Committee of Vigilance. And we are honored to now be hosting him tonight to, as he so eloquently puts it, shed light on 19th century Gotham's forgotten past and to highlight many of the notable teachers, students, and events once associated with this remarkably surviving Black heritage site in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood. Before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that admission to the museum is free for all visitors throughout the month of February in honor of Black History Month, and will also be free in March for Women's History Month, and then in June for Pride. We have a variety of upcoming events, and I encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter from the homepage on our website, vchm.org, to stay updated on all that we have to offer. And I thank you for your support of our programming. We'll have a bit of a Q&A session at the end, so you'll have a few moments to, ask Mr. Washington any questions that you may have. I just ask that you save your questions until the end of the session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Eric K. Washington, who is an independent historian and author and was the preeminent advocate of Manhattan's former colored school number 4, where one of the school's pupils in the 1880s and 1890s was the protagonist of his book, Boss of the Grips, The Life of James H. Williams and the Redcaps of Grand Central Terminal. His book won the Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship of New York History, the Guides Association of New York City's Gannick Apple Award, and a special recognition from the Municipal Art Society's Brendan Gill Prize Selection Committee. Washington was awarded the Historic District Council's 2023 Grassroots Preservation Award and the Victorian Society of New York's 2022 Preservation Award. In March, he is to receive the 2025 Gannick Lifetime Achievement Award. So without further ado, I present to you Mr. Eric Washington.
Hi, thank you, Margaret. And thank you and the Van Cortlandt House Museum for inviting me to speak about former colored school number 4. Something just went blank. Am I still there? Okay. And it's one of New York City's most recent designated landmarks. As many of you have heard, in May 2023, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission voted unanimously to designate a building at 128 West 17th Street in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood as an individual protected landmark. And what's more, on that same day, Mayor Eric Adams pledged $6 million for the building's rehabilitation. So my following slideshow will give you an overview of my introduction to the site, its historical significance, and some of the process towards it getting that designation. As Margaret said, I first became aware of the languishing schoolhouse this was about 7 or 8 years ago, while researching my book, Boss of the Grips, whose protagonist had been one of the school's pupils in the late 19th century, so in the 1880s, 1890s. And when I discovered it, this was November 2018, I appealed to the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission to consider the building for designation. And, my research was bolstered by newspaper accounts, city resources at the New York City Municipal Archives. These were especially helpful to me, particularly like things like the 1940 tax photos, which proved that the building was what I thought it was, sitting on that spot. Board of Education records that informed me who worked there and even who lived there for a time. Vital records like birth, death, and marriage certificates that really helped me to put the building in context with the surrounding neighborhood. And that surrounding neighborhood is what is today's Chelsea, Greenwich Village, and the Flatiron District, neighborhoods that most of you probably know very well as New Yorkers. So I'm happy to share, some of the information that, might shed more light on those areas in those bygone days. As a New Yorker, I know there are woefully too few extant properties that reflect the complex historical trajectory of and milestones and breadth of our great city's African American heritage and experience. But I also know that unlikely doorways often reveal essential but forgotten stories, as demonstrated by some of the many people and events you're about to meet that have passed through the doors of the former Colored School Number 4 schoolhouse. Next slide, please, Margaret. So for 34 years, from 1860 to 1894, the three-story building at 128 West 17th Street embodied New York City's official racial caste education system that covered most of the 19th century. Today, the building is called Colored School Number 4 for expediency. However, it was known successively as Colored School Number 7, then Colored School Number 4, and then finally as Grammar School Number 81. So I'll be using those terms as I go through this. And if it gets confusing, you can ask me to clarify at the end of the presentation. The old schoolhouse duly served numerous working class African American families that were once concentrated in the West Side blocks that were on the fringe of the city's dubious Tenderloin precinct, as it was called, which is now part of Chelsea. And its decades-long use spanned the Antebellum and Civil War eras, the Reconstruction era, and the Gilded Age. The 17th Street building represents Manhattan's only surviving so-called colored schoolhouse, and possibly the borough's oldest extant public education facility as well. Colored School Number 4 was integral to an informal plexus of other African American schools, churches, enterprises, missions, and societies that gave anchor to Lower Manhattan's growing Black enclaves as they drifted upwards up the island to West Side neighborhoods such as Hell's Kitchen, San Juan Hill, and indeed a myriad of citizen leaders who effectively fashioned the even farther uptown community of Harlem in the 20th century. Some of them were the alumni, or their offspring were, of this late 19th century school. But how did the school come about? Slide, please. Historically, Colored School Number 4 was one of a series of schoolhouses that evolved from the African Free School. That's a system that was created by the New York Manumission Society in 1787. And this was to educate Black children, both enslaved and free, at the beginning of what became a protracted process of gradually abolishing New York State's race-based slavery system. And the structure, and you can see on the left slide, that is one of the African free schools. It was from a lithograph by Patrick Reason, who was one of the students, and his brother Charles Reason would actually be the principal of one of the other schools, Colored School Number 3. The structure is a rare example of an 1843 design called the Model Primary Schoolhouse, which the Public School Society adopted the next year in 1844 as an efficient plan for primary school buildings that would be dispersed around New York City, which was then just Manhattan. But in 1853, the Board of Education came to preside over the Public School Society, and it absorbed 224 of its properties, of which 25 were for African Americans. So it's a big differential there. Slide, please. So the three-story schoolhouse was built in 1849 to 1850 at a construction cost of $4,400. And today that would be about $178,000. The former schoolhouse was then sited at 98 West 17th Street, which in 1868, after the Civil War, it was reconfigured and became present day 128 West 17th Street. I don't know why the numbers were changed, but this happened with a lot of streets in the city. And the building lot's corresponding footprint also appears on an 1852 map by Matthew Dripps, and that's the section that you see in the left side of the screen. Even though the 17th Street building was most famously a school for Black children, its first 10 years, from 1850 to 1860, it housed various schools for white students. The same 1852 Dripps map indicates its use by public primary schools 27 and 28, so it's two schools sharing space. 5 years later, municipal records and maps show the building's shared use in 1857 as primary schools numbers 25 and 26. And by 1859, the building housed primary school number 14. And this last one, number 14, gave way the next year to its longest lasting use as a so-called colored school. Slide, please. This 1853 rendering of the 1843 design depicts an identical facade to the present building at 128 West 17th Street. So if you look at the picture, the image on the left, and look at the current photograph on the right, you could see it's basically the same style building with the fenestration. It's the arrangement of the windows. The windows on the left are obscured by trees, but they're 4 across on both the second and third floor, the same 2 doors on the side. Give or take some variations, the dispersed schoolhouses basically followed the prescribed exterior and interior plans, which colored school number 4 also mirrored. Slide, please. And keeping that 1843 model schoolhouse design in mind, here's how the old schoolhouse appeared in 1908. So it's the black and white photos in the upper right. In 1940, the black and white photo on the lower right, and then present day, the color photograph. An 1879 map to the left reveals the close proximity between the school, and I don't think you can make it out, but it's marked C4 for colored, and the African Union Methodist Church 2 blocks away on 15th Street, which gives a sense of the neighborhood's Black population that was present at the time. Slide, please. Now, I should say that when the Board of Education took charge of the schools in 1853, it coincided with active public education initiatives that were already underway by the city's African American community. In 1847, the New York Society for the Promotion of Education Among Colored Children, all the societies had like paragraph-long names at the time, so it's I get tongue-tied. It had been co-founded by Reverend Charles Bennett Ray, whose picture you see toward the left. Pardon me. He was one of the most highly influential and wealthy Black New Yorkers of the day. A clergyman who was also a businessman and an activist, Charles B. Ray evokes an array of charismatic Harlem ministers who were yet to be born. In 1837, Ray became a general agent of the Colored American, the paper that's on the left. And this African-American New York City newspaper was edited by Samuel Cornish, who 10 years earlier had co-founded Freedom's Journal, and this was the country's first Black newspaper. In 1840, Ray was the principal organizer with John J. Zweil, Reverend Theo S. Wright, Charles L. Reason, who I mentioned before, and Timothy Seaman of the New York State Colored Convention at Albany, part of the National Colored Conventions movement that had begun in 1830, a decade earlier. During the 1830s, Ray was also an ardent abolitionist with David Ruggles on the New York Committee of Vigilance, formed of Blacks and whites to assist fugitive slaves, Frederick Douglass being an example, and to thwart kidnappers from abducting free Blacks. In 1963, Martin Luther King would say, I've actually heard Malcolm X say this, and I've actually heard James Baldwin say this, but it's pretty true. It's appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is an 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. However, for over 20 years, from 1845 to 1868, Ray was the pastor of two predominantly white congregations. Under Ray, they were in fellowship with a cohort of Black churches in Greenwich Village as centers of anti-slavery and Black men's suffrage activism. One suspects that they were congregations of abolitionists, as such was the company that Ray would keep. Ray also arbitrated purchases of lots in upstate New York around Lake Placid from white abolitionist Gerrit Smith, which enabled Black men to satisfy New York State's $250 property qualification in order to vote. And the letter shown in the center is one that was written in 1848 on behalf of William Appo, a musician of some renown, who would later become the music instructor at Colored School Number 4, along with some of the other colored schools in the network of them. Charles B. Ray was the father of three notable daughters, the little thumbnails at the top, Charlotte E. Ray, Florence Therese Ray, and Henrietta Cordelia Ray. All three of them were educators, writers, and suffragists. Charlotte, on the left, she was the eldest and notably became the country's first Black woman lawyer in 1872. Florence in the middle, I couldn't find an image for her. But she was the middle daughter, and she became a teacher at Colored School Number 4 on West 17th Street. And Cordelia on the right, the youngest of them, gained acclaim as a poet. Her ode, called Lincoln, was read at the 1876, the bicentennial, centennial year, unveiling the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C. In 1885, she also won a Supreme Court decision for back salary against the Board of Education in New York for having discharged her the previous year, not according to law, it was stated. As a result, three teachers who were also improperly dropped from what was by then called Grammar School Number 81 regained their positions. So they were indeed an activist family. But back to their father, apropos of the colored schools. In 1847, Reverend Ray co-founded and became president of the New York Society for the Promotion of Education Among Colored Children, which opened two schools on Thomas Street and Center Street downtown. In 1855, the society began awarding the annual Ridgway Prize. You see that it's a little medallion at the right, which was bequeathed in the will of a Scottish hairdresser named Charles Ridgway as incentives for Black children in the Board of Education's various racial caste public schools. I've only tracked the prize for 4 years so far, up until 1859, but I believe it likely contributed to the new school on 17th Street the following year in 1860. Slide, please. It was in September 1860 that the Board of Education elevated the former colored primary school, number 1, located nearby in the basement of the African Union Methodist Church that I showed you earlier, on 15th Street, by merging it with a new ward grammar school. So it was an upgrade at the 17th Street schoolhouse that was then being used for white students as PS 14. And this would be called Colored School Number 7 under Principal Charlotte S. Smith, the silhouette on the lower left. In addition to the new colored ward school, number 7 school day school for children, was an evening school for adults. A huge celebration was thrown just before Christmas in 1860 to mark the close of the evening school's first term. And a guest remarked that the schoolhouse was filled to its utmost capacity, there being not less than 500 present to witness members of the night school. He was especially impressed to see so large a number of grown persons, some 60 or 70 years old, receiving their certificates of regular attendance. Then one might also imagine a measure of the reception's significance by the participation of Reverend Dr. James W.C. Pennington in the upper left-hand corner. The then Greenwich Village-based minister, orator, writer, educator, and abolitionist of international renown who came to the crowded schoolhouse to say the benedictions. Ultimately, however, the school's driving spirit was its formidable principal, Sarah J.S. Tompkins, who you see toward the middle. On April 30th, 1863, her 31-year tenure began when she was appointed to replace the late Charlotte Smith, who had recently died that February, as the principal of Colored School Number 7. Slide, please. So Sarah Tompkins is often claimed to be the first Black woman principal in New York City's public school system. This claim is mistaken. And here are some names. You see the silhouettes of 7 Black women colored school principals who preceded Sarah Tompkins. And these are principals who were active in 1862. So just the year that before Sarah Tompkins started. And slide, please. Sarah J. Tompkins had also recently come up in connection with the Jacob Day residence. This was a house at 50 West 13th Street in Greenwich Village that the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated just this past October. For nearly a decade, from about 1865 to 1874, Sarah Tompkins lodged there with her daughter, Serena, and a sister of hers named Emma. And Jacob Day was a prominent Black businessman. He was a caterer and an abolitionist. He not only housed Sarah Tompkins, but he also housed other teachers from New York City's racial caste schools, including Sarah A. Douglas, who would later work with Tompkins, Sarah Hamilton, and notably the late principal Charlotte S. Smith, who Tompkins was hired to replace. But back to Tompkins's hire at Colored School Number 7 on April 30th, 1863. As it happened, dramatic current events put Tompkins on her mettle within her first few months. Slide, please. In July of that year, 1863, the American Civil War had been sundering the nation at large for 2 years. A provision of the law allowed men eligible for the draft to get out of it by paying $300, and that was equivalent to about $7,300 today. This was beyond the means of most. And other factors aside, it helped to ignite what would be immortalized in infamy as the draft riots of 1863. 5 days of bloody mayhem and murder that left an indelible scar on the nation's conscience. What was arguably the most famous casualty occurred on the first day of the riots. On July 13th, at about 4 p.m. in the afternoon, the rabble overtook the Colored Orphan Asylum that was located up on Fifth Avenue at 43rd Street. Irrespective of the children inside, the crowd fiendishly torched the orphanage and plundered what it could before the flames burnt the building to the quick at its foundation. Fortunately, the orphan asylum staff had ushered them all through a back door to safety. But that vicious act was just a warm-up. By evening, the horror of the mobs was in Greenwich Village. Next slide, please. Covering the infamous draft riot of 1863, the New York Times noted numerous outrages upon colored persons who were wantonly set upon, beaten, and frequently killed throughout Manhattan. There were probably not less than a dozen Negroes beaten to death in different parts of the city during the day. Among the most diabolical of these outrages that have come to our knowledge is that of a Negro cartman living in Carmine Street. Coming out of the stable after having put up his horses, he was attacked by a crowd of about 400 men and boys, who beat him with clubs and paving stones till he was lifeless, and then hung him to a tree opposite the burying ground. Then they set fire to his clothes and danced and yelled and swore their horrid oaths around his burning corpse. The next day promised more of the same, some blocks north on 17th Street. Slide, please. Sarah Tompkins was barely 3 months into her new position as principal of Colored School Number 7, which is now landmarked as Colored School Number 4, same place, when the war's ensuing chaos found the school. Despite the previous day's horror, the classrooms were filled with pupils. Now seeing a mob of unruly whites trying to get into the building, Tompkins and her teachers no doubt reckoned the worst. One paper wrote, it seems that two colored women whom the mob had pursued had taken refuge in the school building, and they were determined to get at them. The teachers promptly barred all the doors, and the rioters, after a few ineffectual efforts to break in, turned their attention to a little wooden shanty on the opposite side of the street, rushing into it, attacking the inmates, and committing various depredations upon the building. One can barely fathom the confusion and terror of all the pupils inside. In September, some newspapers reported a Thanksgiving festival of the colored children of Ward School Number 7, under the charge of Mrs. Tompkins, in gratitude for their escape from death during the late riots, was held on Friday in the Sullivan Street Bethel Methodist Episcopal Church. But what one might imagine is those same children decades later as grown-ups, still hearkening back to their dear principal's selflessness in those earlier dangerous times. In 1893, a woman's periodical recalled how on the first day of the riot in New York, Tompkins conducted safely to their homes many children who had attended her school that day before starting for her own residence in Brooklyn. So she was indeed, a generation later, quite legendary. Slide, please. By the following spring, the unrest on 17th Street had ended, but just a few blocks down from the schoolhouse, the street was a scene of bustling activity that captivated the pupils. Set up along the 17th Street side of Union Square, that's the north side, the Metropolitan Sanitary Fair of 1864 was a monumental civic festival to aid the Union Army's sick and injured. Tompkins notably engaged the school in the city's major war relief effort, albeit off-site. Farther down at Shiloh Presbyterian Church on Prince Street, which was then under the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, the renowned abolitionist, educator, and later statesman, Colored School Number 7 gave a musical and dramatic benefit in aid of the soldiers, no doubt for the newly formed 20th U.S. Colored Infantry in particular, who ceremoniously received their colors in front of the Union League Club, which was on 17th Street, across from Union Square. Slide, please. Soon afterwards, Reverend Garnett, himself a graduate of New York's African Free School, left New York for a ministry in Washington. Again, he left for presidency of Avery College in Pittsburgh, where his wife died in 1870. Returning to New York, Garnett inevitably reconnected with Sarah Tompkins, who was ever a community activist throughout her tenure. In March 1871, Tompkins initiated a series of public lectures in the schoolhouse on 17th Street. By now, this was renamed Colored School Number 4, as we're calling it today. The first speaker was the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, whom Sarah Tompkins married 4 years later on December 28, 1875, becoming ever after Sarah Garnett. And this is a name, I don't know if any of you out there are tuned into HBO's miniseries, The Gilded Age, but this past season they introduced a character by the name of Sarah Garnett, who the real Sarah Tompkins Garnett inspired. Next slide, please. Oh, if we could just go back to that last slide, just I want to point out this is a copy of their marriage certificate that I was able to locate. They were married in Brooklyn. And these things are always fascinating to me. So the names below the newlyweds contain the minister and one of the witnesses. One of the witnesses, Georgina Putnam, was a teacher in the colored schools in Brooklyn. And the minister was the initials A.N. Freeman, Amos Noe Freeman, who was a noted Black abolitionist who was very much engaged on the Underground Railroad. He helped to harbor John Brown, who was connected with the famous Harper's Ferry incident. So these were the circles that The Tompkins and the Garnetts all moved around. And the little house that's on the townhouse on the side is at 175 McDougal Street. It's still there. It's still lived in. I think it was built around 1837, but that's where they lived in around 1880. She remained there for most of the 80s, and it's there to this day in Greenwich Village. Okay, next slide, please. While living at that address on McDougal Street in 1880, Reverend Garnett was championing an ardent relief effort to aid the Arkansas refugees. And these were hundreds of poor Black emigres seeking to move to Liberia, but, quote, being turned out of their homes in Arkansas when the purpose of their leaving was known, unquote. They reached New York before time for sailing, where they were stranded. In ways that sadly ring familiar today, the refugees were quickly disparaged and suffered media accusations of being secretly rich and dishonest. But Reverend Garnett, other Black clergy, and numerous citizens, Black and white, rose to the occasion to provide the refugees funds, food, clothing, and shelter while they waited out their unavoidable displacement. And the New York Sun reported that while waylaid here, many of the refugee children went to school to Mrs. Highland Garnett, Sarah Garnett, at Colored School Number 4. Slide, please. Besides Henry Highland Garnett, other notable visitors associated with the school included Lieutenant Governor Oscar James Dunn of Louisiana, Henry Austin Flipper, who was the first Black graduate of West Point. He visited while he was still a cadet at the school. Sir James Bain, who was the Lord Provost of Glasgow, who was visiting New York during the centennial year, 1876, and being shown around by the New York City mayor of impressionable things to show off the city. He brought Sir James Bain to Colored School Number 4. And J.A. Arno, who was a Shakespearean actor and a journalist of one of the noted Black newspapers of the time. Newspapers also cited the school's engagement during notable events that included the presidential inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant in 1869, the memorial to U.S. Senator Charles Sumner, whose name has come up in recent years. He was an abolitionist senator who was beaten on the floor of Congress by another senator because of his abolitionist views. Sarah Garnett got the school to participate in the memorial of U.S. President James A. Garfield in 1881, where her daughter, Serena Tompkins, was the organist. And they had an on-stage participation in Louise A. Smith's The Little Mountain Fairies at Chickering Hall, which was a concert hall that was located, I guess it would be called the Flatiron District today. It's where Oscar Wilde first spoke when he came to New York. Slide, please. So for roughly 6 years, from about 1878 to 1884, the Board of Ed wrangled over the colored school question. And not infrequently rankled New York's African-American community in the process in trying to determine how to absorb the schools into the general system. Should the schools be consolidated or should they be abolished altogether? And Black community was not monolithic on this issue. Yeah, so it was of much debate for all of these years. Despite the school's sad origins from the slavery era, these few Jim Crow schools, nevertheless, took a pride of place in the African-American community because they served them well. Many acknowledge that this owed especially to their diligent core of Black teachers. Yet the board's Committee of Colored Schools conspicuously overlooked Black teachers in its sweeping reform. In 1879, the board's early notions to close the colored schools foresaw the obvious consequence of assimilating Black pupils into the white student body of schools and classrooms. But ironically, it advised there was no probability of the admission of colored teachers to the mixed schools. And this exclusion of Black teachers who had made the vocation their life's calling, indeed through the same training and experience as their white counterparts, fueled the African American community leaders and citizens to convene a mass meeting at the venerable Lyric Hall on 6th Avenue and 42nd Street. That would be like just across from, like I said, Bryant Park. It fell to the Reverend Henry Highland Garnett to convey their resolutions to the board, whom they urged to keep the existing colored schools open so long as the numbers in attendance justify their continuance. But the status of the schools remained in limbo a few more years. On February 12th, 1883, Lincoln's birthday, the lingering proposition to close these schools galvanized Sarah Garnett. She was the recently widowed Garnett, to another mass meeting, this time at Chickering Hall that I mentioned. And encouraged by a letter from Frederick Douglass, they again implored the Board of Ed either to place Black teachers in equality with white teachers or else to leave the colored schools as they were. And something closer to the latter was achieved. Ultimately, in 1884, a legislative act signed by the New York State Governor Grover Cleveland closed all but 2 of the separate race-based schools, sparing Colored School number 3 on West 41st Street and Colored School number 4 on West 17th Street, which were thereafter designated Grammar School number 80 and Grammar School number 81, respectively. As for their collective staffs, the Board of Ed's annual report noted that the colored schools as such were abolished, and the 20 teachers of those schools are now included in the mixed grammar and primary departments. This claim appears more hypothetical than actual. Whereas it was Black student attendance that now constituted the general public schools as mixed, hiring biases still relegated Black teachers to their 2 newly numbered grammar schools. Until one student, Susan Elizabeth Frazier, broke the color line a decade later. However, a news item in the New York Freeman suggests, indeed, the transition from colored to grammar school seems less than a seamless name change. In 1885, Cordelia Ray won the Supreme Court decision for back salary that I mentioned, when she proved that she was discharged improperly. In the following years, Sarah Garnett personally distributed flyers on the street to persuade parents and guardians of extra seating capacity being available to all. Her efforts rallied support from numerous Black clergy and news editors, such as John J. Freeman of the Progressive American, J.A. Arnault of the New York Enterprise, and T. Thomas Fortune of the New York Freeman, in which a columnist declared, "It is lamentable to feel that such an old and honorable landmark should have to appeal to the masses for attendance after its established reputation, and the many proud examples turned out in past years." Interestingly, in 1888, both Sarah Garnett and Louise Clausen, the white principal of Grammar School number 48, which was 11 blocks north on West 28th Street, remarked upon a noticeable attrition of their respective Black students and white students due to the color line. Grammar School number 81, Principal Sarah Garnett said, "There's a decided decrease in the attendance here, attributable to the throwing open of the general white schools to both white and colored. This was formerly known as an exclusively colored school, and our pupils came from all parts of the city, but now they have left in order to attend schools near their homes." And this made sense in a lot of ways because the city was growing and people were moving out of the old neighborhoods up the island to places where they could go to school closer to where they lived. And at Grammar School number 48, which had been exclusively white before then, Principal Clausen cited a very perceptible falling off in the number of white scholars. The former daily average of pupil attendance of 500 had now purportedly fallen off to not more than 300. The colored element, she said, was on the increase. The paper reported her to say this, claiming the colored children in her school were being aided at the expense of the white children. So both principals, Garnett and Clausen, appear to observe their base student demographics diminishing. But whereas Garnett cited Black student attrition at her once exclusively colored school to the community seeking more convenient facilities, such as the better equipped Grammar School number 48, Clausen cited white student attrition as a result of Black student enrollment, a pattern that later generations would term white flight. In 1894, the Board of Ed finally closed former colored school number 4, and it determined the building was no longer required for school purposes and resolved to sell it, but obviously it did not. A year later, the New York Herald would report that Grammar School number 48 was now predominated by 33% attendance, actually not at all a predominant figure, of Black students who, coming from near and far, regarded it as their fashionable school, adding that there were few pupils of purely American parentage. That's to read white, not Native American. Um, it unfortunately perpetuated the bias of African Americans being a demographic of outliers. For Sarah Garnett's part, she and a number of her teachers transferred to the former colored school number 3 on West 41st Street, and she remained an activist, educator, community leader, and a suffragist. In 1895, she co-founded an association to build a community hospital, and later in her native Brooklyn, she and her sister, Susan McKinney Stewart, the state's first Black woman to earn a medical degree, founded the Equal Suffrage League, which in 1908 joined with the National Association of Colored Women to petition the U.S. Congress for women's right to vote. At her memorial in 1911, personal testimonials were heard from her active allies, civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois and the journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett. And this was commensurate with the high reputation that Garnett had built at colored school number 4. By the time the school closed in 1894, Garnett's diligent core of African American teachers had long made it a singular part of the Black community. The school's other remarkable teachers included, slide please, Bostonian J. Imogen Howard, who joined the teaching staff in 1868. And she was an award-winning essayist. She was also a musical prodigy. And she was the first Black graduate in her schools in Boston. And she came down from there in 1898. And later on, in 1893, New York Governor Roswell P. Flower appointed her to represent New York State at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. She was the only Black manager of the World's Fair. And in 1900, she was the only Black winner of the Evening Telegram newspaper's Great Teachers Competition that was sent to the Paris Exposition of that year. Slide, please. In 1865, William Appo, who I mentioned earlier, he joined the school staff. He was described as the most learned musician of the race. He started in the late 1820s with the legendary Black maestro Frank Johnson, the little color vignette in the lower left. They were associated with some of America's earliest public concerts by Black musicians, including soprano Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, known as the Black Swan. And they toured England together in 1837. In 1839, Apple performed at a public fundraiser here in New York City for the African captives of the Amistad, who were jailed in New Haven, Connecticut. He was also aligned to white abolitionists Gerrit Smith and John Brown near Lake Placid, New York. His daughter, Helen Appo Cook, taught at Manhattan's Colored School number 6. And she's interesting because she figures into giving a perspective on the prevalent prejudice that was afoot at the time. Helen Appo graduated with another teacher, Elizabeth Jennings, who's a name that some of you may recognize. She's often called the Rosa Parks of New York a century earlier. Similarly, she had been thrown off a streetcar and she sued and won her case in 1855 that awarded her $250 and helped start the groundwork towards desegregating public conveyances in New York. So the two of them graduated in 1857 from the normal colleges, the teachers' college at the time, but they weren't permitted to take their diplomas with the rest of the students. They were the only two Black students at the Academy of Music celebration. Next slide, please. Susan Elizabeth Frazier, she descended from New York ancestors who fought in the American Revolution. And she grew up on West 17th Street on the same block as the school, where she graduated in 1882. In 1895, her landmark lawsuit resulted in her becoming New York City's first Black teacher who was assigned to what they called a mixed public school, meaning anybody could go there. In 1911, she spearheaded a call to action to women's clubs to care for the aged and indigent Harriet Tubman, who was living in long retirement in Auburn, New York. And during the Great War, before we started giving them numbers, World War I, Frazier was president of the Women's Auxiliary of the old 15th National Guard. This was the African-American troop, best known as the 369th Harlem Hellfighters Regiment. She was purportedly the first Black woman to be buried with full military honors. And in 1919, that same newspaper contest, the Evening Telegram's Best Teachers Competition, based on public votes, sent Frazier on a teacher's delegation to the recently hushed European battlefields of the war. Next slide, please. And notable graduates of the school included Walter F. Craig, who was an acclaimed violinist and composer. He was born in Princeton. His family moved to New York. So he entered the school when it was at 98 West 17th Street and called Colored School Number 7. And when he graduated, the street number, the building number had changed and the school name had changed to Colored School Number 4. It said that young Walter F. Craig had taken up the violin in 1868, and he debuted in public at a concert at Cooper Union in 1870. His rapid improvement led him to organize his own orchestra in 1872, which showcased his musical talents as really a first-class conductor and composer. One person said he now enjoys the honor of being the representative colored violin soloist and musical director of the race. His orchestra is quoted as being second to none, and his fame as a soloist extends throughout the entire United States and also some foreign countries. Indeed, he was the first in 1886 African-American to join what was then the all-white musicians union. And in 1892, he was among the first African Americans to perform at what was still the new Carnegie Hall. And he was hand-selected by Antonin Dvorak when he visited New York and established the National Conservatory to be one of the musicians, chief violinists. Slide, please. So this is somebody if you see the little ad on the left-hand side, and you saw it on the previous page for Walter F. Craig, this was a benefit for the school in 1889, and it featured a number of artists, including graduate Walter F. Craig as musical director, and a singer by the name of Desaria Plato, and an elocutionist, Ednora Nahar. And I just found this wonderful photo cabinet card on the right of this opera singer on eBay just a few weeks ago. So you're seeing it for the first time. It's not really clear when it was made, probably in the 1890s, but she was an incredible artist who in her early years performed at this benefit for Grammar School Number 81 on 17th Street. She's the earliest known Black female performer at Carnegie Hall to date, the earliest one that's on record so far. She was also recruited by Dvorak for the National Conservatory. And she performed also at Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1893. And she performed as Carmen in the opera in the all-black opera company of Theater Drury at Carnegie Hall in 1901. Next slide, please. And the famous elocutionist, Boston's peerless queen of the stage, Ednora Nahar. She was a cousin of the teacher Imogen Howard. Started making uh, her mark in the public around 1883 when she started gaining attention as what was called a platform performer in Boston as an elocutionist. And this was a very common art form at the time, where people would just do readings of different works, and many works were published for that purpose. And there were certain gestures that went along with the readings that helped to dramatize or accent the comedy of the piece that was being recited. And she was one of the foremost black and white who was on the scene at the time. She also performed this benefit for the school in 1889, as I mentioned. And that same year, she came to New York. She studied drama under Dion Boucicault, who had a theater company in the States. And that same year, she also formed her own management company. It was an all-black troupe of soloists called the Ednora Nahar Concert Company. This was a popular pattern at the time for theater people because there weren't many black theater companies. So you would form a group of soloists. So she was an elocutionist. She might have a violinist. Sometimes it was Walter Craig, a soprano singer, somebody else, a performer. Another violinist was Joseph Douglas, who was a nephew of Frederick Douglass. And this way they could put on a full program. And as they were traveling, if somebody couldn't make it, there was usually some local artist who they could recruit for the program in that locale. And she also took on to manage the very famous Sister Rita Jones, who was known as the Black Patty, as a co-star in 1896. And next slide, please. And close to my heart is the eponymous subject of my biography, Boss of the Grips, the life of James H. Williams and the Redcaps of Grand Central Terminal. So as the station's chief Redcap attendant for nearly half a century, Williams presided over its essential Harlem-based workforce that produced the city's first Black police officer, Columbia University's first Black architecture grad student, and still such familiar names as Paul Robeson, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., to name, literally hundreds more. And next slide, please. So the school is, I think it opens a singular window on African-American narrative of New York City's history. It's heartening that a few years ago, unrelated Brooklyn Public School and a school in Chelsea a couple of years ago, each of them respectively changed their names to the Sarah Garnett School. I think that, the fact that it's now been designated a protected landmark is more than a great honor. I think it's important in the times that we're living in, which are precarious times for these kinds of monuments, where powers that be and powers that want to be are trying to change the narrative of our city's history. So thank you for allowing me to share with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has.
All right. So, Eric, we have a question from Catherine. Would you like me to read them to you, Eric?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I can't
Okay.
see them. Yeah.
So Catherine asked, well, she says, so interesting. Have you been in the building? Is there anything left from the school?
Yes, I've been in the building, and there's very little so it ceased to be a school in 1894. And then it went into the hands of the city, turned it over as a sort of a headquarters for local zouaves. These were Civil War veterans, so sort of kind of a clubhouse. And they had it until about the 30s, and then New York City's Department of Sanitation took it over, and they still own the building. So it's been changed. It's been reconfigured on the interior a number of times. So there's some wainscoting that we noticed that looks like it's probably original to the building. The facade is original, although it was painted over at some point. It's white now. Um, and that was probably done by sanitation in the 30s. So if you remember that black and white photo when it looked um, like a like a brick building, it's still brick, but it has this sort of veneer over it. But the windows, we believe, are original, and the panes are like those little square panes, um, 16 over 16 sash windows. And from the outside, they kind of look like stained glass. Well, they are stained glass, but they're stained not by artisans, but by city soot, uh, over a century and a half. So we think those are original, and we're hoping that they stay intact when the facade is replaced. But there's nothing really on the interior that really evokes a setting where the teachers and students would have um, been taking classes. Rooms have just been rearranged and reconfigured, and it's a fixer-upper.
And we have a guest that says, "Thank you, Mr. Washington. Very interesting. I hope the city will follow through on rehabilitating the building."
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions? Oh, Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie. How are you? We are hoping to make it available, yes. And if we do, I will reach out to you. Okay. Jennifer says, "Thank you for your research. I do not live in New York City or have family, but I have done similar research for a famous school in Washington, D.C., Dunbar
Hmm.
High School. My grandparents and mother attended in the early 1920s and 40s.
Oh, I'm actually researching somebody now who went there. So I don't know if you're on a alumni association or anything, but I've been trying to reach somebody.
All right. And Catherine asks, has anyone thought to do an excavation of the yard? That's a good question.
Yeah, um, it might happen. I don't think there's a sense that anything's going to be found there, but it's like leave no stone unturned. Um, right now, we're still trying to deal with, the bureaucracy that is the city agencies. So we're still talking and expressing, what we'd like to see done and that sort of thing. And the sanitation's administration just changed over, so we were really welcomed by the past commissioner, who is now commissioner of the police department. So you know how those things go. It's a matter of reintroducing yourself and that sort of thing. So, but I think it's a viable possibility that there might be something there, but I don't know. Things have been changed so often over the years, but you never know. You never know.
All right.
Yeah.
We have a guest says, in the Gilded Age storyline about Sarah Garnett, there are Irish students recruited to keep the school open. Is this true?
So I found that surprising. In my research, I have not come across that. My sense is that that was developed for the story narrative, and it works for that. I've never come across that, and I think if that were, and my sense indeed is, while it was ostensibly open to anyone, I think that it doesn't feel consonant with the times that Irish students would have gone there when they could have gone to the other schools that were public. So, but it may be. I know. I think it's a great thing when historical figures are used in fictional narratives, and I was thrilled when the Gilded Age, you know, created a Sarah Garnett character, and there's an official HBO Gilded Age podcast, and I was called um, by one of the hosts. Um, to consult with it, about that. And that was how I first learned of it. And it was thrilling. But there are certain things. So they have her as a dressmaker, and she may have made dresses. People, were wont to make their own clothes then. I mean, you did what you could, but I think that you might get the sense she was a dressmaker who also happened to teach, and that indeed was not the case. She was, first and foremost, an educator. She'd been teaching since she was 14 years old, and that may be new to a lot of people. We had in New York what was called the Lancasterian system, or a monitoring system. So, like, if you were sort of a star pupil, you would be put in charge to teach lessons to a number of the other pupils. And this is how a lot of teachers in New York cut their teeth on teaching, through this Lancasterian system, and she was one of those. So she might have made dresses. I think she might have had a dress shop, but that was not the forefront of her career. That's certainly not what she was known for. It works for the story narrative, for the miniseries, but I think the person who inspired that character is far more complex and interesting.
All right. And the guest with the connection in DC has provided their information, which I will pass along to you, Eric. Um, Marina says, thank you so much for your presentation. Do you foresee it becoming more difficult for buildings such as this one to be designated landmarks given the current attacks on DEI?
I Yes, yeah, I do. I mean, New York is not like the rest of the country, but it is part of the rest of the. So you don't know uh, what's going to happen. I'd like to think that we can sort of resist that. Um, but certainly this is a distinct possibility. And that's why I think things like this, public programs where you can talk about these things and kind of keep them current no matter what happens, as long as we still have free speech. I'm, knocking on wood here. Um, that's something that we must do. Um, but I know it was, as I said at the beginning, there have been too few of these around. And so it was really a boon to get this. It took 4.5 years, but it happened. Um, and I know Landmarks has been working a little bit more diligently to try to find sites of African American relevance in the city, because we're part of the city's, we're coming up on the 400th anniversary of New York City, and African Americans have been part of um, that history for all 4 centuries. Um, and I know they were thrilled to be able to find this building, because even of the things that are landmarked, there are very few properties that are landmarked from this particular period, from the Civil War and pre-Civil War and Reconstruction era. So and then the Jacob Day house that I mentioned is another one. Um, so my hope is that there will still be sites um, that get tapped and successfully designated, despite what's coming out of Washington.
Hey, Bruce says, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Is there a plan to reinterpret this as a school museum?
So this was always the question, like, what would you like to see? And sort of an informal consensus is that um, it would be some sort of a cultural institution where it has an education component, a gallery component, performance space. Um, while it's small, if you blink, you'll miss it. But when you're inside, it goes through most of the block. So, when I first read, before I'd been inside, that account of there having been uh, 500 people inside, and I thought, okay, here's some hyperbole afoot. But when I was inside, I could actually see it. There was space for that, with all 3 floors, and so that's what the general consensus is, that it will be I wouldn't say a museum per se, but it's a sort of a lyceum where you have, public programs, um, maybe learning programs. If anybody asks me, it's not my building, but if they ask me, I would like to see, a full AV center, where you could do podcasts there, or people could learn basic broadcasting, a full kitchen, so when you have your exhibit there, and the wine and cheese, you could actually have a place to prepare food, but also food education. And this is enjoying, like, there's the Netflix High on the Hog, which I recommend, a documentary on African American food culture. And this is enjoying, much interest these days. So I think all of these kinds of things are to be successfully integrated into a cultural center there on the block. So, you know, it's good to keep all that stuff in mind and keep, as possibilities and at the top of the discussions, but it's not clear what it's going to be because it's still in the hands of the city and they still have to clean it out.
All right. Gregory says Allison Stewart of WNYC is a Dunbar alum, as are her parents. She wrote a book about it. And
Oh, okay. So
I
I've been
had,
on her show a few times. I didn't know that. Thank you. Yeah.
is that Allison Stewart who was formerly on MTV?
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I
Just
know her
curious.
from the show, radio show, but I'm not
All
sure.
right. And Gregory says he had two cousins who graduated in the 50s from Dunbar. All right. Evelyn says, thank you for your presentation. I found the history fascinating. Are you working on similar research projects on schools in other boroughs of NYC?
I'm not. So I'm working on a couple of projects, both of which came out of this my same Boss of the Grips book. One's on a 20th century actor who came to New York um, to be an actor in 1925, and he started getting a lot of work, but he was a red cap for a while. And his story is fascinating. And then in a whole other era, I'm working on a group biography of some of the notable teachers, students, and visitors who passed through the doors of Colored School Number 4. So they're two separate periods, but they both came out of uh, the research that I had started doing to write the book. So my focus is going to be on that school, not so much in other boroughs. But there are fascinating stories everywhere. And if that interests you, I'm going to plug somebody else's book. There's a new book out called Brooklynites, um, which is a lot of the same history, and it focuses on four Black families between the Revolutionary War and Reconstruction and their generations that lived through Brooklyn. Pretty. Can say. And so you should have her up there. And she focuses on the colored schools in Brooklyn, and their history is very, very different and fascinating. So that might be for the person who's asking the question. You may want to look into that. At least you get two boroughs out of the way. I can't vouch for Staten Island and Queens.
Evelyn says that they are from Brooklyn.
Okay.
And Gregory and Jacqueline have confirmed that it is the Allison Stewart from MTV.
Oh,
I remember the name. It's an odd connection that I remembered that name immediately because I remember it felt like she was a real journalist as opposed to some of the other VJs. So when you said there
okay.
was a radio show, I just made that connection.
Yeah.
And Gregory states that her book is titled First Class.
Oh, great. I have to look for that. I didn't know that. I didn't know there was a Dunbar connection. So
Any
the
other?
fellow I said, the actor I'm writing about, he's the one who went to Dunbar. That's why I'm curious to talk to someone.
All right. Any more questions from folks? Pamela says, thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I suppose that we will wrap for the evening. If any of the attendees, our guests here, have any further questions for Mr. Washington, You can certainly feel free to email us at the museum. It's information@vchm.org, and I will be sure to get those questions to him. And once again, please let's give a round of applause for Eric K. Washington and this fantastic and fascinating talk. And I want to
Thank
thank all
you.
of you for attending this evening.